As we get ready to get started, if I could just have everybody quiet, please. All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jalen Andrews. I am the president of the Black Student Association here at Butler Community College. The Black Student Association is dedicated to the principles of self-determination, self-awareness, and unity, and strives to unite and educate students of multicultural descents about their cultural heritage. Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to acknowledge our president, Dr. Kim Craw, and thank her for creating a campus environment that is inclusive. I'd also like to acknowledge, yeah, come on, give a round of applause. You're doing great, of course. And I'd also like to acknowledge the staff and members of BSA sitting in the back over there. Special thanks to Matt Jacobs and the Butler Media Department for helping us stream live this evening on BCTV, excuse me. All right, welcome everyone. Our speaker tonight is a New York Times best-selling author, former journalist, and historian. He serves as a trustee at the University of Kansas School in Journalism, and he serves as a professional in residence at the University of Oklahoma. He is the proud recipient of over 20 industry and community awards, including 3 golden medals from the Kansas City Press Club, and currently serves as the Deputy Director of Strategic Initiative with the American Civil Liberties Association of Campus. We are honored and very, very, very fortunate to host him. So without further ado, I would like you all to get your hands together and give a round of applause to Mr. Mark McCormick. Welcome.
I didn't realize we were going to be on BET tonight. You didn't say BET, did you? It's in Video Soul, is it? Before I get started, I'd apologize for something. I'd apologize for this picture. I'm just not photogenic. I just really have a hard time when people point a camera at me. Will you forgive me? Okay. How's everybody doing tonight? So I was telling some of my friends, where's David? Oh, there's David. Me and David go back a ways. And I was telling David that my oldest son is now in the Navy. And he's living in San Diego when he's not out at sea. And I'm going to be talking about giants and monsters tonight. And he's kind of the inspiration for it. When he was very, very small and he was eating a cookie, I would call him the Cookie Monster. And for some reason, this would really offend him. He was very angry if I called him the Cookie Monster. And he'd say, "I'm not the Cookie Monster. You're the Cookie Monster." He couldn't really say Cookie Monster. But I just remember being a young person and being afraid of Bigfoot. Do people even talk about Bigfoot anymore now that it's been debunked? You know that picture where it's very clear that this person is in a gorilla outfit, but for some reason I was just terrified when I saw the picture of Bigfoot. But sometimes monsters and giants are just our ways of trying to explain things that we have difficulty understanding and explaining. So I'll be talking tonight about how the giants keep coming. And hopefully, I'll keep it brief enough. I was just telling the Vice President that blessed are the brief, for they shall be invited back. This is my second year, so I did pretty good last time. But my speech is just a hair over 20 minutes, and then maybe we can have a conversation afterwards, or you can leave if you didn't like it. So, 9-year-old Bobby Wilson, a black New Jersey fourth grader, simply wanted to do her part to ward off an invasive species of bugs, the spotted lanternfly. She'd learned about these bugs at school. So this tiny scientist concocted her own repellent made up of common household items, poured it into a spray bottle, and then asked her mother if she could go outside. And her mother said, yes, don't go very far, and keep your phone on. So this little girl wandered down the street in her predominantly white neighborhood, squirting bugs and keeping them in a plastic bottle. There's this beautiful innocence about the child and her sense of wonder about the world. The kind of wonder adults like me envy and grieve long after it's taken from us. It's kind of like the magic of Christmas when you find out that there really is no Santa Claus. Bobby believes that she's just like everyone else. She believes that maybe she's even special because she's going above and beyond and trying to help this problem. There's a light in her heart and in her little smile. But the giants are coming. A white former city council member, an ogre that I call Gordon Lashy, actually called the police on this child. In her, he saw something to fear. Quote, there's a little black woman walking, spraying stuff on sidewalks and on trees, he reported to the police. I don't know what the hell she's doing. Scares me, though. It's likely that the 71-year-old man actually knew who she was because he lived directly across the street. The giants are coming. Christine Frazier had been to hell and back, and her wounds had not healed. Chris, as she was called, had worked very hard her whole life, and she and her late husband had dreamed big for themselves and dreamed big for their family. They played by the rules, they owned a business, they raised a daughter. But again, enter a giant. This time in the form of a 2012 foreclosure that shattered her life. Her husband had lost his legs to diabetes, and the weight of the family survival had suddenly shifted to her shoulders. But by age 65, she was out of work. She was living in a senior facility. Her cherished house was gone. Her health was deteriorating. Her dreams were destroyed. This is kind of an uplifting message, isn't it, tonight? Before her eviction, she lived with her 85-year-old mother, her adult daughter, her 4-year-old grandson, and their dog, Sheba. The sheriff's deputies arrived in the middle of the night to evict her. Quote, they came in like I was a dope dealer. It was the scariest thing that I can remember in my life. My grandson, who was 4 at the time, and to this day, he does not like police officers because he remembers. He remembers. The police officers swarmed, ordering everyone to get dressed immediately, and then the police began the grim task of emptying the house of all of its memories. It was chaos for 7 hours. The police piled her life out on her yard. She remembers everything being scattered without any care across her lawn. With nowhere to go, the family slept in a car that night, everyone except for Sheba. The police had actually made provisions for Sheba. Said Chris, this was the part that I think came out in the eviction. When they came for me at 3 a.m, they didn't have a place for me and my family to go. But they came with a place for my dog. The giants keep coming. A few years ago, I met a woman who had survived the infamous 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama, that killed 4 little girls. That bombing turned 60 this year, by the way. She shared 2 stories about monsters. One involved the conditions under which the hospital kept her beloved grandmother. During segregation, if they let black people in the hospital at all, they were kept in the basement where they were cared for there. The other story involved her love for spelling. She'd been the best speller in her class, then the best speller at her school, and she was looking forward to competing against the best spellers in her state. She'd spent hours and hours practicing, only to learn that black children could not participate in the state spelling bee. She was an older woman sharing this story in front of an audience in Topeka just a few years ago, and I could see how hurtful that moment was still, how it dimmed the light in her eyes and the light in her heart. Yes, indeed, the giants keep coming, and they can be many things. Mythological creatures, similar to us, but possessed with tremendous size and strength. Beast-like, able to move mountains. They're violent, menacing, threatening to consume us. But the giants I'm talking about tonight are invisible, but remain ever present. They comprise a system, an infrastructure. They are spirits, but they are not ghosts. They are like the internet or the electrical grid, things that move powerfully around us but are unseen. They are not people per se, but they do operate inside people, inside their hearts, inside their thoughts. They are the spirits that tell someone to call the police on a child in their neighborhood, and then to tell the police that this child is a woman who scares them. There are spirits that would arrange for accommodations for a dog. Oh, thank you. But not for a 4-year-old. They would tell a child that she could not participate in a spelling bee and that her mother deserved to receive care. Well, what little care she would get in a segregated hospital in a dark and dirty basement. These spirits loom large. They seem unstoppable. Thus, the names that I'm attaching to them like monsters. But these monsters aren't mythological. They're very real, and they feed on fear, and they feed on ignorance. And the more frightened we are, the bigger they get. The more ignorant we are, the stronger they get. So on this night in February, Black History Month, the shortest month of the year, we got the month with some of the days missing. I just want to share with you some thoughts about how these monsters behave, how they shapeshift, what some of our brightest thinkers have said about them, and most important, how to defeat them not just today and not just tomorrow, but from now on, because the giants keep coming. Before I get to that, though, I just want to take a moment to point out some things that African Americans have been the victims of this kind of vicious mythology. We've been called lazy, super predators, welfare queens and welfare cheats, liars, and much worse. But here's the reality. Although black children are depicted as the face of poverty, 65% of poor children simply are not black. The Army says black people serve in the armed forces at rates far out of our proportion to our presence in the society, so why aren't we the face of patriotism? Also, black men are often depicted as the men most likely to abandon their children, but the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention say that black men are the men most involved, most engaged as fathers. So why aren't we the face of fatherhood? It's because the giants keep coming. As black people in this society, where race served as an organizing principle, we have continued to be the targets of these kinds of negative portrayals, despite our work, despite our excellence, despite our service, James Baldwin, who's one of our most eloquent and elegant authorities on these subjects, said this more than 50 years ago. It's a quote. "There are days, and this is one of them, when you wonder what your role is in this country, what your future is in it. How precisely are you going to reconcile yourself to your situation here, and how you're going to communicate to the vast, heedless, unthinking, cruel white majority that you are here. I'm terrified at the moral apathy, the death of the heart, which is happening in my country. These people have deluded themselves for so long that they don't really think that I'm human. And I base this on their conduct, not on anything that they say. And this means that they have become, in themselves, moral monsters. The giants keep coming. And the giants are greedy. They overwhelm us because they loom large and can seem like abstractions. And to give them shape and to give them depth, they've actually been described as monsters, like Dracula. Dracula is actually a critique of capitalism. Think about it. Dracula is rich. He's an aristocrat. He's always in a tuxedo. This is good Cape weather. He lives in a castle. And how does he live? He lives by sucking the blood or life from the unwitting people around him. Now, I should say I'm not an anti-capitalist. I just think that capitalism needs guardrails to protect people from the kind of low-road capitalism that we practice in this country, the kinds of predatory practices that destroyed Chris's dreams and left her life scattered on her front lawn, the kind of low-road capitalism that dictates that only some people deserve health care when we can all clearly afford it, the kind of low-road capitalism where big pharma prices have medications far out of our reach in terms of our ability to purchase them. To me, that's monstrous. And notice how they behave when they can't bluff you anymore. When you critique them, he's always going to come back and say, you're doing precisely what he's doing. Distort, deflect, divide, and distract. You may not remember, but during attempts to pass Obamacare a few years ago, hysterical people showed up at public meetings to say that the government was trying to establish death panels, knowing full well that the real death panels were already in effect. They were the insurance companies who deny you care. My own mother passed away needing a heart procedure that she'd been asking for many years, but her insurance company determined they would not pay for. As schools took deeper dives into the murkier depths of our racial history, the giants screamed indoctrination, while at the very same time banning books and prohibiting what history could be taught. I mean, consider what Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is doing right now in his attack on AP African American history. These similar forces continue to call Colin Kaepernick un-American. But really, what is more un-American than compulsory patriotism? I mean, supposedly, you're supposed to be free to think for yourself in this country, not told to be a patriot. Forced patriotism is what they do in North Korea and other communist and authoritarian countries. The giant's defense system activates to thwart any resistance it senses in us. Why do you think so many of these monsters want to stop the teaching of real history? Why do they want to move education behind gates and gated communities and out of the reach of everyday people? They don't want you thinking for yourself. You see, the giants maintain power over us by trying to keep us small. They need us feeling scared. They need us feeling powerless. Back in 1977, when I was 10 years old, a singer and a songwriter named Randy Newman wrote a song called Short People. Some of the lyrics went, short people, I'm not going to sing it. Short people got no reason. Short people got no reason to live. They got little hands. They got little eyes. They walk around telling great big lies. They got little noses and tiny little teeth. They wear platform shoes on their nasty little feet. Somebody's really cracking up back there. I don't want no short people around here. And the song was really popular. It got to number 2 on the charts, became a gold record. But predictably, some people just went nuts about it. A guy and a legislator in Maryland tried to introduce legislation to prevent it from being played on the radio. And thankfully, the Attorney General explained that would be against the First Amendment. But what the legislator missed, and what a lot of people missed who were upset about the song, is that the lyrics were actually a critique of prejudice. The song's bridge literally says, short people are just the same as you and I. All men are brothers until the day we die. But in a sense, Randy Newman was right. There are giants in our society who do not want any short people around here, meaning they don't want anybody around that they cannot control. James Baldwin studied this. He said this in a book that was written recently by Princeton professor Eddie Glaude. And this is Eddie Glaude writing about Baldwin. He says, in 1964, James Baldwin wrote an essay entitled The White Problem. He has this formulation that says the people who settled this country had a fatal flaw. They could recognize a man when they saw one. They knew he wasn't anything else but a man. But since they were Christian, and since they had already decided that they came here to establish a free country, the only way to justify the role that this chattel slave was playing in one's life was to say that he was not a man. Because if he wasn't, then no crime had been committed. That lie is the basis for our present trouble. Dr. King saw these giants too. Just before he died, Dr. King wrote this in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? This is a quote from Dr. King. Negroes have proceeded from the premise that equality means what it says, and they have taken white Americans at their word when they've talked of it as an objective. But most whites in America proceed from a premise that equality is just a loose expression for improvement. White America is not even psychologically organized to close the gap. Essentially, it seeks only to make it less painful, less obvious, but in most respects, to retain it. So yes, the giants keep coming. But here's the thing about giants. They only seem invincible. They're not. But it takes courage and knowledge and engagement to defeat them. So as I close, I want to tell you about the late Judge William Kunstler, who wrote in his memoir, My Life as a Radical Lawyer, about how an art critic once pointed out to him that Michelangelo's was the only depiction of David before he killed Goliath. As an aside, I want to mention if you've seen the movie Malcolm X, Bill Kunstler is the judge who sentences Malcolm X in Spike Lee's movie. But David is standing there, Kunstler writes, like T.S. Eliot's J. Alfred Prufrock, asking himself, do I dare? He has the rock in his right hand, the sling over his left shoulder, and he's watching this giant Philistine come over the Galilean hills, and he's thinking to himself, if I throw this rock and I miss, I am one dead Israelite. If I throw this rock and I wound him, same thing, I'm dead. But if I hit him and I kill him, I've done a great deed for my people and maybe for myself as well. David is portrayed in the exact moment of hesitation that comes to everyone, the moment the idea crosses your mind that you might do something, that you might say something, whatever that might be. So why am I talking about giants and monsters and economics? Because Black history, if it's taught us anything, that Black people are resilient. One of my favorite educators, Jawanza Kunjufu, used to say that African Americans have taken America's best shots. The Middle Passage, the slave trade. We've been subjected to gruesome experiments, sharecropping, convict leasing, Jim Crow segregation, crack cocaine, and today's mass incarceration. All of that, and we're still here, and we continue to achieve. The fact that you all are here and in college and trying to do something for yourselves is something of a miracle. I think that deserves some applause. So yeah, we got some problems, even some serious ones, but we're still here. And do you dare? I'm going to answer that for you. Yes, you must. And what does daring mean? It means not allowing fear to paralyze you. It means continuing to arm yourself with information and education about your history, because it is impossible to continue to oppress a consciously historical people. Let me say that again. It is impossible to continue to oppress a consciously historical people. I didn't say anything about weapons. I didn't say anything about military strategy. You are invincible if you are consciously historical, because you will always know what to do when you know who you are. Why do you think people are criticizing people for being woke? They literally need you to be asleep in order to keep robbing you. So dare, do it for yourselves. If you can't do it for yourself, do it for that little girl who thinks that she can win the state spelling bee. Do it for the next Chris, who's waiting to be evicted after falling victim to a predatory lender. Or do it for Bobby, who thinks that she really belongs. And do it, and show her that she really does. Thanks for listening. I'm not sure what's supposed to happen right now. Looks like the police are coming. Well, I should say it like he says it. The police are coming. That's a great question. Did everybody hear that? She was asking what I do at the ACLU, and I had shared with her earlier that I was in Wichita Monday because the ACLU is trying to eliminate the death penalty here in Kansas. Whether or not you face the death penalty largely depends on where you live. You live in Wichita, a place that has a lot of resources. You're much more likely to face the death penalty than you would if you were in western Kansas, where there's not even a prosecutor in your county. We're making a novel argument. In order to do death qualification, which is the selection of jurors who will sit in judgment of the person who is facing the death penalty, you have to be willing to vote for death. That automatically eliminates a lot of people of faith. A jury is supposed to reflect the conscience and the prevailing views of a given community. And if you take the people of faith out, what you have is a jury that is much more likely to convict and a jury that is much more likely to vote for death. If you're excluding people of faith, in particular, you're going to be excluding black women, who are disproportionately people of faith. So if black women cannot serve on death panels, we really have to begin to question its overall fairness. That's one of the things that we do. A few years, and I should mention that someone who's very, very dear to me testified at our trial on Monday. One of our attorneys from our national office saw her sitting in the gallery with us and then asked her to come up and testify, and she did so brilliantly and eloquently, and I know it's going to embarrass her, but I don't care. I love her. Dr. Gretchen Ike is here. Please stand so we can recognize you. So by now you've probably heard that in 1958, a group of Wichita young people performed the first successful student-led sit-in anywhere in the country. We only know about its historical significance because of Dr. Ike's book, which I would recommend to all of you, Dissent in Wichita. It is a wonderful history of civil rights, not just in Wichita, but in the Midwest. One of the things I learned in the book, which I tell people about a lot, is that it took Wichita longer to integrate its schools than a lot of schools, even in the Deep South. When I got out of college, I went to work in Louisville, Kentucky. Louisville, Kentucky actually closed their public school system rather than integrate. That's why the public school system there is the Jefferson County public school system, not the Louisville public school system. That was one of the things that I picked up from her book. So I hope you'll forgive me for calling you out that way, but I felt like, the students had a right to know. Well, you published my book, but I'm not here to pitch a book. He has a copy of my book. Any questions? I'd like to have a conversation with you. Oh, well, I mentioned the death penalty. A few years ago, about the time I started, there was a black man in Tonganoxie, which is between Lawrence and Kansas City. He was moving into his home in the middle of the night, and the police handcuffed him and held him at gunpoint for moving into his own home. We stood with him there. There were two instances where African American students were being harassed on small campuses because they had locks. And they came to us and we represented them. I feel like successfully, but we can't really talk about what happened, but we stood with them. Also back in 2018, the city of Dodge City, which only had one voting precinct in the city limits, closed the one voting precinct they had in town, moved it outside the city limits, near the country club, outside and away from the bus line, and we sued, and we forced them to move 2 or 3, I think, polling places back into city limits. And we also were able to do that because there was a complaint, asking what they eventually acceded to, but they said they couldn't afford to establish any polling places in town. But I asked a reporter to file what's called a CORA request, Kansas Open Records Act, and the CORA revealed that the woman who closed the polling place and then moved the polling place outside the city limits had spent $70,000 on lawyers to fight calls from the public to open a polling place in the city limits. And it only costs about $5,000 to open a polling place. And it's much less because they already had voting machines. So that was a huge victory for us as well, and we got national attention for it. We also fought and got rid of something called documentary proof of citizenship. Our current Attorney General, when he was Secretary of State, established this rule that in order to register to vote, you had to have a birth certificate, which we argued in court was an onerous requirement that surgically attacked certain groups in the voting public. For instance, if you were a woman who had gotten married and your name didn't match exactly, they could prevent you from voting. If you were born at a time where you were born at home or on a farm and you may not have had access to your birth certificate, you couldn't vote. And these are folks who believe that voting should be a privilege, not your right. And so whenever those kinds of things happen, we show up and we sue people. So, yes, ma'am. Yeah, it depends on the state. Here in Kansas, you can vote. If if you've been released and you're returning, you can vote. Now, yes. What's complicated is I'm always talking about Florida. It's not an accident that when you hear a story about someone eating an alligator, it begins with a Florida man. Florida's crazy like that. But in Florida, there was an effort where people like LeBron James and other people, what they wanted to do was pay off everybody's fines and fees to free them in order to vote. The governor there complicated the law so that you couldn't do that. So there were people who had served their time, but they still had fines and fees hanging over their heads, so they couldn't vote. And that just reminds me of one more thing I want to mention, that we're fighting right now to end juvenile fines and fees. I don't know any 12-year-old or any 14-year-old who has the $4,000 or $5,000 to pay the court fines, pay the court fees, in order to get out from under all this debt that has been piled onto them by the criminal justice system. We feel like it's unjust, and we just did a blog. If you go to our website, acoukansas.org, we have some stories there, but the one that stayed with me the most was this little girl was put in, she was locked up in juvenile jail when she was 10 for theft. While she was locked up, her parents died. And she was supposed to be getting a death benefit, a Social Security death benefit, because her mother passed away. Well, when juveniles are locked up, the state requires the parents to pay child support while the kids are locked up. So her parents are gone. She's 10 years old. They take the Social Security death benefit and burn it up, paying for her incarceration. That's the system. Now, I have said for years that if you want to know what's happening in a society, you need to go into a school. Everything that exists in a society exists in a public school system. I now believe that you have to take a walk through our criminal justice system or our criminal injustice system to see what's happening. I considered myself someone who was pretty knowledgeable because I'd covered these things as a journalist, but I was shocked at some of the things that we found out. It's just really important that we stay engaged, we stay woke, despite calls that we stay asleep, because these things are happening to people every single day. And they happen because we give up and we get apathetic, and that's precisely what people want. They want us to be quiet, they want us to go to sleep, they want us to walk away so that they are at the controls. So I'll take the student and then the police. Ma'am? There's always, I'm sorry. She said, do I have any words for allies who are in the room? That's an interesting question because, in my office, it seems like we get hung up on things that we probably shouldn't be getting hung up on. Like we get hung up on words. For instance, someone in one of our meetings said, I want to be an ally. And then someone else said, well, you shouldn't be an ally, you should be an accomplice. That means you're getting in trouble with me. I think the spirit is the same. I think what's most important for allies or for anyone is to find ways to get involved. There's so much work to do. Voter registration, we're always looking for volunteers. We're always looking for people who will write for us. We're always looking for people who will knock on doors and canvass for us. I mean, if you think about it, if you think about the last few presidential elections, our elections have been so close that a swing of maybe 2 or 3 percentage points could swing the election. So no one can argue anymore that their vote or their input or their engagement doesn't matter. This is the best time, maybe ever, and maybe the most important time. I can't remember a time where our democracy was under attack in the way that it's under attack now. I'm still thinking about like that January 6th attack. And then we're not supposed to be political, but I'm just stating facts here. The person who organized it is still running for office. It blows my mind. But that happens when a core group of important people just bow out of the system. We got to get people back involved, back engaged, so we can take the country back. Mr. Policeman. That's a tough question. The policeman was asking me. I got to tell this story. So, Glendale used to be a police officer in Wichita. And he pulled up behind one of my cousins, lights and sirens. Cousin was sitting there in a car like this, and Glendale walked up laughing. Plays too much. But in terms of like what people should do across racial lines, or narrow that down for me a little bit. Well, one of the reasons I'm standing here today is because newspapers have essentially died. Thousands of papers have closed since 2009, where I was last employed at a newspaper. And I'm mentioning that because the newspaper used to be critically important to how we managed our democracy. It's referred to as the fourth estate. It's critically important to the maintenance and care of a democracy. So it's important because we have different ideas about what truth is anymore. You know, once upon a time, you could read in a newspaper that something happened, and most of the society agreed. And you get at truth when you stack a fact on top of a fact on top of a fact, and at some point, at the top of that stack, you've arrived at truth. Well, now CNN has a stack of facts. Fox News has a stack of facts. MSNBC has a stack of facts. And so it becomes difficult, almost impossible for us to have conversations about the things that we need to do because we're operating under a different set of facts. So to your point, I mean, if you'd asked me this in an era where newspapers were strong, I would have said what you need to do is dive into newspapers. Like when I was in journalism school, we had like 5 or 6 newspaper subscriptions: the Lawrence Journal World, the Kansas City Star, the Wichita Eagle, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. And you read them, and then you're kind of up to date on things that are happening. What I would suggest today is read a paper that is left of center. You know, maybe the New York Times. Read a paper that's right of center, like the Washington Examiner or the Wall Street Journal. Read some media who's right down the middle. They're trying to go right down the middle. You have to be informed on issues before you can help with anything. So I think being informed is the most important thing. And if you are getting your news from the internet, make sure that you're following news organizations like the New York Times, the LA Times, the Chicago Tribune, to get your information. Because unless you're informed, you can't really help anyone. You might do a lot to hurt things if you. We found that out with our previous president. So, yes, ma'am. Wow. It is. I mean, I was telling Alitra beforehand that a few years ago, Bernadette Gray Little, who was the chancellor at KU, first black woman to have that position, she spoke at my museum when I was the head of the African American Museum in Wichita. And she was sharing with me on the car ride, I was taking her to catch her flight. And she was sharing with me that the legislature was not just hostile to KU and its funding. It was hostile to education in general. And that I don't think the goal is necessarily ideological. I think the goal is taking this pool of money that is being spent on public education and steering it toward private schools. The reason that we have people in Congress like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, and people who don't seem at all qualified or at all serious about really governing, it goes back to what I was saying in the speech, is that people like that give you a headache. And you decide, I just cannot with this lady today. And over time, people withdraw. You know, my former boss wrote a book called Public Journalism, and we used to practice public or civic journalism. And it was different than the kind of journalism I was taught in school. Buzz Merritt, who wrote the book, he was arguing that we had gotten really good at telling people what was wrong in newspaper stories, but we were burying them under bad news. We never had any solutions, but we were always pointing out what was wrong, right? So he said, if you look at how newspaper readership was going down, and it was on a chart, you could lay that chart directly on top of voter registration, and it was identical. That what people were doing were, they said, I'm going to go to work, I'm going to come home, and I'm going to drive into my garage, close the door, and go inside and not get involved in anything. So they weren't engaged civically by reading, which meant that they weren't voting, and if they were voting, they were uninformed about what was happening. There has to be, you know, Dr. King talked about a revolution of values because we had become this thing oriented society and not a people-oriented society. Well, there needs to be a revolution of civic engagement in the country. And it can't be for sport anymore. We can't afford that anymore. It can't be entertainment. It can't even be edutainment. We have serious issues to solve. And I realize that you were saying that you wanted an answer that was better than just get involved. But to me, that's the basis of it. Now, my boss, a guy named Michael Kubik, he actually has a mathematical formula. He said if you can capture about 25% of registered voters, you could swing the election any way you want. And when you were asking your question, the first thing I thought about was August 2nd of last year, that people were feeling so hopeless about that vote and how it was coming. And then everybody was shocked how people kind of rose up and voted it down. Well, what Micah says to us on the staff is that we can't be so dour about these things. It doesn't help anything. You have to stay positive, and there really is a path forward. And at the risk of some self-promotion, I would recommend that you join the American Civil Liberties Union. But because we are fighting on no fewer than 96 different fronts: immigration reform, privacy. There are these towers on the highways that are downloading people's information, and nobody knows about it. And that's one of the areas where we have common ground with people who are very conservative. The Americans for Prosperity, a very conservative group, is working with us to fight against these juvenile fines and fees. So there's a fight on every front that you could join and be a part of. And when you're a part of the organization, you're fighting all these fights. I wish I had a better answer. Yes, ma'am. So a few years ago, a gentleman from North Carolina called me at my office in Kansas City and said he was with an organization called States Newsroom. And as I've shared, newspapers have been shutting down, but right before they were shutting down, they were closing their capital bureaus. There were people who covered the legislature in all these different states. States Newsroom is a nonprofit organization that is setting up bureaus of reporters to cover, state politics, because nobody was covering state politics. And they wanted me to run it. And I said, no, I think I've made my run in newspapers, but I know of someone who'd be really great. And so I recommended a friend of mine who's doing a tremendous job. And the paper here in the state that's part of the States Newsroom group is called the Kansas Reflector. And I write for them 2 or 3 times a month. I also write for the Kansas Leadership Center, say that 5 times really fast, the Kansas Leadership Center's quarterly journal. I have a column in the back of the journal. And I also have, as Gretchen and Mike was actually waving the book, but I have a book of columns from about 10 years of my work as a columnist at the Wichita Eagle. At the time, I thought I only had 5 good columns, but Gretchen thought I had 50. So we ended up with a book. But the Kansas Reflector is a good place, and the Kansas Leadership Center's journal is another good place to find my work, but to find that work. And Gretchen and Mike also run a publishing house called Blue Cedar Press. And the whole goal of Blue Cedar Press is to promote progressive voices and to get progressive voices into the civic bloodstream. And they've been doing a good job of that as well. Oh, yes, absolutely. KansasReflector.com. Yes, sir. I got you. Man, that is a fantastic question. So, one, it goes back to something that I said before. Can you hear me? I'll get back behind the mic. That's a really great question. The first thing I would say is that you got to be informed. I loved being in school. I loved being in college. But I didn't love being broke. So I wanted to go to work. So I mean, if I hadn't been so broke in college, I probably would have went and got, a master's degree, a doctorate and stuff like that. But you really have to study a lot. And one of the things I enjoyed most was having deep conversations like you're talking about with people from other walks of life, whether they were people who were from rural areas in Kansas, whether they were people who were Jewish. Like I had a friend who invited me to a Seder at the Hillel House. The Hillel houses are the houses for Jewish students that are on campuses all over the country. And so I got a sense for what their feelings were politically, how they viewed race relations. There were Palestinian students there, so I got to talk to them about how they're treated in what was Palestine. Asian students, and one of the things that was so interesting to me is that no matter the culture, whether you're talking about East Indian culture, Hispanic, Latin culture, this culture, the darker you are, the worse society treats you. There's colorism in absolutely every culture. And so it was very connecting. And then so all of a sudden I'm thinking, not nationally, but I'm thinking internationally. And what happened to Malcolm X, is when he got international in his view, when he wanted to go and talk to the United Nations about the human rights abuses that were happening every day, stuff we're still talking about, I think that cost him his life. But the best thing to do, have conversations, learn, read as much as you can, and then strike up these relationships. Relationships are really important, not superficial relationships, but, as a journalist, my relationships were more important than anything. I'd show up at a scene, and people had to trust me immediately in order to tell me things. That's how I organized my beats. I'd read, if I started a new beat like I did in Kentucky, what I did is I read the last 10 front page stories on a particular subject, and then I wrote down all the names of the sources, and then I called all the sources, and I asked them for 10 people and 10 story ideas. And before I got down to the bottom of the list, I had this huge spreadsheet full of people to call, right? We need that kind of depth and that kind of connection to fight those kinds of battles that happen on campus. I'll say this and then I'll shut up. So we were always protesting on the KU campus, me and my friends. In fact, we were kind of at odds with the Black Student Union. Don't get mad at me, Black Student Union. But we were upset with the Black Student Union because they weren't outspoken enough. So a young black woman was delivering pizzas to a fraternity house. And when she walked in, they were drunk, and they started pushing her. They knocked the pizza out of her hand. They were calling her the N-word and the B-word, and they surrounded her, and she thought, oh, these people are going to attack me. Scrambled to her feet and ran out. She called the campus police, and when she said, this is the SAE house that did this, they said, oh, they're off campus. I can't do anything about that. The next call she placed was to my house, to me and my roommate. So my roommate pops into my room and says, now you will not believe this, but they attacked a sister at the SAE house. What should we do? I said, we should go over there. So it was 10 o'clock at night. So we started walking across campus, and by the time we got there, all the football players were with us, all the campus, people who would protest with us, they were with us, and they had called the police, and the police were waiting on us when we got there, right? You don't want to end up in a confrontation like that. I had to go to the chief of police and say, I can get everybody off this lawn. You don't have to hit anybody with a nightstick, because they came out with their nightsticks on. The police had their nightsticks. You don't want to let things get to that point. What we ended up doing afterwards, we had some really substantive conversations. with the SAEs, with the police department, with the administration, about legitimate issues of safety for people on campus. And something good eventually came from it, but it's all about your relationships and all about your conversations that you're having. But that was a fantastic question. Thank you for that. Oh, hi. I'm glad they changed the name. Wow, where I came from. Like, you mean like, he's trying to interject. So here's the story I always tell. So I have a sister who's about 15 years older than me. And when she was in high school, she went to Wichita High School Southeast. She was the high school journalist of the year, back when the Wichita Eagle would have a contest. And she won that. And when she won High School Journalist of the Year, she won a scholarship to the KU School of Journalism. I still have a picture of her, you know, in a miniskirt, which was a scandal to my aunt, who thought that the skirt was too short. But she had her little suitcase, and she went to the William Allen White School of Journalism and Mass Communications. We had all kind of Jayhawk stuff around the house. She was my inspiration for journalism because she was 15 years older than me. When she left, there was just this vacuum. And she would write us letters. And I just remember sitting on the floor in my mother's bedroom while she read letters from my sister Chan. And I just remember thinking, wow, I would love to be able to write like that someday. And I ended up at the William Allen White School of Journalism and Mass Communications, where I'm now a trustee. I grew up on Volusia in Wichita, right across the street from the Lynette Woodard Center. I grew up down the street, or a block away from Barry Sanders. In fact, I write in Barry's book that was one hell of a street, because not only was there a NFL Hall of Famer there, but across the street from him was one of the early black airplane pilots. He sold airplanes, he flew airplanes, Rip Gooch, who also served in the legislature. His daughter is the owner and publisher of the Community Voice, a black newspaper that circulates statewide. There was an ebony fashion model, also on Volusia, a guy that we went to high school with, Don Eaton. Going the other direction, I had two cousins. One was a federal agent for the IRS. She tells me that she eats lawyers for breakfast when she has to do an audit. And now she's an executive for Love's, one of the, you know, when you go to Oklahoma and they had those Love's truck stops, she's an executive for them. And her sister is a physician, a psychiatrist, who was the national resident of the year at the KU Med Center. And then their dad owned a construction company. So you just had like this incredible 2-block stretch of black excellence. And Glendale will tell you this too. Our families are from an all-black town in Oklahoma, Boley, Oklahoma. So our folks raised us a little different in terms of like our interactions with the larger white culture. We just kind of had our own ideas about who we were, and we weren't subject to the same kinds of mythologies that I was talking about in the book. But I was fortunate that I had a wonderful journalism teacher there who was, you know, very inspirational, and a guidance counselor, Tommy Williams, who actually fished an application for a journalism workshop at KU out of the trash because they said, there are no black or minority journalists here at North. And then Mr. Williams said, oh, yes, there is. Give me that. And that's how I ended up at KU. That's how I ended up with all the scholarships, and that put me on the path. And last story, I'm sorry, but I was going to work at the slaughterhouse because I just didn't see a way to get to college. But I was going to work at the slaughterhouse but pay for college because I had heard they make pretty good money. But when I left KU on my way to my first job, I was on my way to Louisville. The packing house where I was going to work was already closed. So 4 years out of high school, I would have been jobless and I wouldn't have had a degree and I wouldn't have been on my way. So again, the fact that you guys are here in school, it's wonderful. Keep at it. Did I see a hand go up? Or are you just ready for me to stop? Okay, thanks for having me.
Wasn't that amazing? I want to say, I know everybody's getting antsy and ready to go, but I just went to the Wichita Chamber of Commerce has a chairman's luncheon, and the title this year, the theme was Faithful Investments. And they were talking about how people invested in them, and they were encouraging us as business leaders to go back and invest. And one of the little nuggets I took away from there was once you make a decision, live decided. And that just struck me. It struck me, and I was like, oh my gosh, that is so powerful. So when you talk about advocacy and championing and how can I get involved, live decided. If that's what you want to do, then take the steps, which means do your research, get to know other people, figure out how we have so much more in common than we have that's separated, and figure out how we can exist together, but live decided. So I am super amped up, and I thank you so much, Mr. McCormick, for coming and visiting us. And thank y'all so much for being here. I really am touched. I know some of y'all got dragged out here, but thank you so much. Before you leave, can we please get a picture with the students and with Mark? We have several people taking photos. So before you leave, just stop, take a second. And Mark said he has cards so that you can take one. And let me tell you, if he says that he will respond to you, he will. He will respond to you. You can have conversation. And that's one of the things that I love since I met him last year and we exchanged information, that he really will respond when you have questions. And that's a wonderful resource to have in our community. So thank you very much. Have a good night.